Okay. Got the DVD here?
Okay, throw it in. If it opens.
Yeah. It's old technology here. All right. Ah, there it goes.
Sounds like it's working.
Can't believe we get to watch this thing.
Kevin and I were sitting at a desk in a hotel room in Bangor, Maine last spring, hyped on complimentary hotel coffee and pretty damn excited to be watching this 30-year-old documentary. It's called My Mother's Murder.
As you might have guessed, the film is about Sissy Stewart, created by her younger son, Charles Stewart. He's a documentary filmmaker who's since won Emmys for his work.
People who lived in Princeton made sure to catch this when it aired on HBO's America Undercover in 1992. It's not every day that a flagship true crime-y documentary series is focusing on a crime in your town. And how often do you watch a son dissect his mother's murder for a national TV audience?
It was pretty somber and conservative for America Undercover. But Charles did point the finger at the person he blamed for the murder, Gerald Giffard. He shot footage of Gerald appearing in court for the stabbing of that young woman in her shower. And he narrates, "I think this man may have murdered my mother."
But the rumors in Charles' hometown about who was responsible, he said they were actually about his family.
The gossip in Princeton was that my brother or I had killed my mother.
I was so shocked to hear this, both that he brought up this idea and faced it, and also that it was the first we'd ever heard of anyone suspecting Charles, even if it was just gossip.
Right, he couches it as just rumors. But we know investigators were still looking hard at Jeb at this point.
What was your reaction to this documentary, Kevin? I mean, I had heard that he put Gerald in it, but I think I was expecting that to be a bigger part of it.
Yeah, so I was expecting a straightforward crime documentary, but it was so much more about Charles, his growing up with her, and how the loss affected him.
And I got the vibe that he doesn't think the police are going to solve it. That's how it seemed in that footage of the press conference where the family announced that $25,000 reward right after Sissy died. And then they later upped it to $50,000.
Anybody who knows who it is and come forth with information that will help the police, because we're dead serious about having some answers to this.
In that clip, Charles Stewart sounds like he's demanding justice. And throughout the documentary, he expresses a cool anger and frustration.
But if you're thinking you'll just pull up the HBO app and stream it for yourself, you can't.
This documentary isn't available anywhere. We couldn't license it through HBO, and the Princeton University Library has a VHS copy, but they won't let you watch it. Finally, I got a copy from someone who had it all these years.
Which was our only option, because Charles Stewart controls the rights to it now. He didn't return Kevin's calls, but we were finally able to reach him via letter and explain our project. And he responded. He was emphatic. He did not want us using any of his documentary as we told this story of his mother's death.
I'm Kevin Shea.
And I'm Rebecca Everett. This is In the Shadow of Princeton, a podcast from NJ.com and the Star-Ledger about the unsolved killing of Princeton's grande dame, Sissy Stewart. Now, on some level, I can understand Charles Stewart's response to us. He lost his mother. He saw the news headlines about her death as sleazy, and he may see us the same way.
But to me, this is one of the things that makes this cold case like none other. It just feels like there's a pattern of contradictions, the way people's tunes keep changing. On one hand, you're broadcasting your mother's murder to a national audience, but now you're resisting attempts to resurface her story?
And on one side, you have Charles making this documentary about her death and how it's still unsolved, while Jeb is quoted in the newspaper saying the family needs to move on and not worry about whether the killer would be caught.
In this episode, we'll dig deeper into the Stewart family, and we'll try to get to the bottom of a pretty shocking allegation we heard, that the prosecutor was interfering in this case.
And we'll try to explain this dichotomy. Things like how they posted a $50,000 reward, but then some relatives did not cooperate fully with police. And as the years marched on, they go quiet. When anniversary stories are published, it's investigators who are giving the interviews and calling for tips. The silence from the family is deafening.
I remember calling up Jeb to see if he wanted to talk with me for an article about the investigation in 2003. He told me he doesn't comment on the case anymore and said literally, "Been there, done that." I was kind of stunned.
It's certainly not suspicious for someone to choose not to talk to reporters. People do that all the time. But what you don't hear too often is relatives of a murder victim not helping authorities when they come knocking. It started with denying access to an alibi witness, and then progressed to refusing to do additional interviews or requiring police to talk only with their lawyers. That's what we heard from retired investigators.
But first we need to give you a better sense of who this family is. Just trying to figure that out wasn't easy. But we were able to use public records, archives, and Charles's documentary, and we found a handful of people who knew them.
When it comes to Sissy, Charles's film paints a better picture of his mother than we ever could. From her youth as the second of 4 children, craving attention and given to mischief, to a young newlywed mother, to her later years as a church-going divorcee with plenty of wit and humor,
which she'd employ to tease Charles, all in good fun. He said he and his mother had that in common. They liked to have a good time.
As I was trying to learn more about this family, I talked to Norman L. Cantor, one of Jeb's childhood best friends, who also grew up on Mercer Street, where they'd see neighbor Albert Einstein ambling down the sidewalk with his shock of white hair. Norman said many summers were spent hanging out at Sissy's house with Jeb and a few friends, playing bridge or watching American Bandstand.
Jeb was a delightful person with an acerbic wit, I would say. And he had a great sense of humor. He was articulate. He was smart.
As you might expect for a pair of well-to-do sons of Princeton, both boys went to prestigious private schools and then Ivy League colleges. Jeb, the eldest by 3 years, went to Phillips Exeter, did his freshman year at Princeton, then joined the Army and eventually graduated from Columbia.
Charles went to Andover and then Dartmouth College. At the Ivy League school, he was the handsome captain of the hockey team and pledged to one of the most prominent fraternities, Delta Phi Alpha.
The Stewart parents divorced in 1964. Charles said it wasn't really talked about, but it seemed like his mother never really got over the shock of the breakup. Several years later, their father Donnie remarried.
After college, we see the brothers' lives really diverge. Jeb dutifully returns to the Princeton area with his wife to help run the family newspaper and raise 2 kids, Craig and Lori.
But Charles had different ambitions. He worked in TV news and then went out on his own, making TV specials and documentaries.
Jeb and his wife Sheila ran the newspaper together after Jeb's father died in 1981. Ralph Teresiano said detectives interviewed Town Topic's employees about their bosses.
She did the hiring and firing and reprimanding of the employees, and she was definitely the more assertive of the 2 of them.
It sounds like both Sheila and Sissy were somewhat dominant in their respective relationships with Jeb, and Ralph said there might have been some tension. But that's not why we're talking about Sheila here. It's because we've learned from police documents and interviews about how Sheila reacted when it came time for cops to interview her family members.
Right, so remember, Sheila's alibi was that Sunday she drove her mother back from the Jersey Shore and got home around dusk. But Ralph said police couldn't verify that with Sheila's mom.
We tried to interview her mother, but she did not want her mother interviewed.
And a memo from a few years later said Sheila's mother refused to be interviewed by a task force looking into the crime.
We heard from retired investigators and read in a police report that Sheila also didn't seem keen on police interviewing her kids. Craig, a sophomore at Princeton University at the time, and Laurie, a senior in high school.
Being protective is understandable, but Laurie was important. She could confirm Jeb's alibi.
It was more than 3 weeks before police interviewed Craig and Laurie.
Right. Craig says he was at a Grateful Dead show in Pittsburgh, and Laurie does confirm her dad's alibi, that they stopped in Princeton the afternoon Sissy was killed and were apart for a brief time while she walked on campus to try to get the car keys from her brother.
Other family members were interviewed, like Charles and his wife, who told police they were at home with their kids in Massachusetts, hours away from Princeton.
But within a few months of Sissy's death, police are hitting those dead ends we've mentioned. So they try something else.
Detectives asked Jeb, would he take a lie detector test?
Now, we know that today, polygraph tests are not considered scientifically reliable because they can register false positives and negatives. But they were used frequently in the 80s and 90s. Stipulated polygraphs were even admissible in court.
We asked Jeb to take a stipulated polygraph back in June of '89, and he refused.
Ralph said he was thinking, if your mom was killed, wouldn't you say yes? So police could eliminate you and just focus instead on the real killer? So he tried again with Jeb a few years later.
His attorney, which he hired an attorney right off the bat, says that he would not be taking a polygraph, whether stipulated or non-stipulated.
Did anyone else in the family refuse to do polygraphs, or?
Well, Charles, when we interviewed him, he was mad that we asked his brother to take a polygraph. And he said, why don't you ask me to take a polygraph? And I said, okay, will you take a polygraph? And he goes, no. But I got the feeling he was in solidarity with his brother, because his brother wouldn't take one. It would look really bad if he took one.
Or is it the whole family is just fed up?
Right, because one explanation for not fully cooperating with authorities is that the Stewart family just got sick of the police acting like one of them did it. I mean, in that case, would you be excited to be re-interviewed?
And it's not like police could point to any motive.
Yeah, if you're thinking, a woman of means, it must have been about money. Her sons did inherit from her. But police dug into that right away and didn't find anything strange.
Her total worth was about $1.5 million, and that was a lot of money back in 1989.
And a fair amount of it was cash, nearly $700,000 just in her trust account and bank account.
Just to be thorough, we pulled a copy of her will on microfilm at the county offices. It looked really boilerplate. Everything went to her living trust. But the timing was interesting. Here's us going over the will at a local diner. Her most recent will is from the 21st of February in the year 1989. So that's just months before she died. I wish
Not even 2 months.
Yeah.
February 20...
Oh, you're right. 21st.
It's like 7 weeks.
Oh, you're right. Jeez Louise.
It's actually more like 6 weeks. The will was created and her trust set up 40 days before she died.
But Jeb told police that setting up the trust was his mother's idea, to avoid probate and taxes.
And there were no red flags police could pinpoint, like a beneficiary with a bunch of gambling debts. The timing seemed like a coincidence.
Both Charles and Jeb seemed to be doing fine financially, from public records and what police could tell us.
And it seemed like if they needed money, she would give it to them. She lent each son $50,000 the year before she died, when Charles bought a big house in Cambridge, outside Boston, and Jeb got the vacation home in Bayhead on the Jersey Shore.
About 6 months after her death, her son sold her house for $600,000 to the local branch of Opus Dei, which most people know as the sect of Catholics that was rather vilified in the Da Vinci Code.
And with that, the Stewart family's 38-year dynasty on Mercer Street came to an end. But of course, Sissy Stewart's murder remained unsolved. And if it did start to fade from people's minds, Charles Stewart's documentary brought it all back.
But some Princetonians we talked to thought it was surprising that he'd even make such a film. Lear's magazine even ran an article suggesting there was something sinister and cold about the film, right down to Charles's tone of voice as he narrated.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but take a listen to this clip.
I was angry that my mother had died for no reason. I was angry that after all the commotion and the sleazy headlines, it wasn't going to make any difference.
Does he sound cold there? I think he sounds like he's going for angry. But hey, he's not a professional voiceover guy. He's a son talking about his mom.
I can see why Charles made this documentary. He's using his medium to tell her story. But there was one thing that really struck me. Jeb isn't in it.
Yeah, he doesn't appear at all. But there was that one surprising mention in the documentary of what Jeb did the day he realized his mother was missing.
My brother had become worried at not hearing from my mother. He'd called the house several times. By noon, he'd gone to the police to report her as missing.
So I'm hung up on this, and Kevin and I don't agree here. To me, just saying he called a few times sounds like a blatant distortion of the facts. Nothing about Jeb searching the house but not the basement, or waiting to report her missing.
But see, I think maybe Charles didn't even know these details when he made the documentary, because maybe Jeb hadn't told him.
That's possible. But the documentary also doesn't mention that the family actually took back the reward money 6 months before the film aired.
Yeah, the police announced publicly that the money was being returned, but we learned from retired cops and documents that it was rescinded.
But it isn't the returned money that seems strange to me. It's that on Christmas of 1991, the Town Topics ran a statement Jeb wrote about this. And the vibe was, our family is focusing on the positive. Let's all move on.
And he quotes from a surprising film, Cape Fear.
Jeb wrote, life is a process of moving forward, of accepting what has happened and cannot be changed. A line from a current movie goes something like, quote, if you hold on to the past, you die little every day, end quote. The Stewart family has too much to live for to let that happen.
Yeah, he's quoting from a thriller about a psychopath rapist and serial killer who terrorizes a family.
But Jeb also wrote about the nice ways they treasure Sissy's memory, like Charles naming his daughter after her grandmother. And then there's this, quote, ending the reward at this time does not mean our family has lost hope that the murder will ever be solved. Rather, it reflects a desire to close perhaps the final chapter in this terrible tragedy.
My reaction to this was just, how can you say that's the final chapter? How about an arrest as the final chapter? Isn't that the goal here?
It's just a surprising message. This is not a family without power. They have influence. They have the ears of the public and, as we'll hear next, the prosecutor. But is this really the message you want to send?
So if you live in Mercer County, especially in the Trenton area, you're familiar with the Trentonian. They're my competition. It's a tabloid newspaper that doesn't shy away from a little controversy or scandal.
Didn't they used to have a girl in a bikini on page 6 to, up readership?
Oh, they still do. They still do. But that doesn't mean that they don't also get great scoops. When they have something good, they'll drop a big, shocking headline that takes up the entire front page.
And this next chapter of the Sissy Stewart case starts on April 2nd, 1991, with one of those jarring headlines. Cover-up hinted in Princeton murder. Just when the case couldn't seem more strange and convoluted, now we have accusations that someone powerful was meddling in the case. And the allegations weren't coming from just anyone. It was from the former Princeton police chief.
The man he accused was Paul Koenig Jr. He went by Pete. He was the Mercer County prosecutor, so the top law enforcement officer in the county. And on the 2-year anniversary of Sissy Stewart's murder, the retired Princeton police chief publicly accused Pete Koenig and his assistant prosecutor of interfering in the case, trying to force them to focus the investigation on Gerald Giffard.
Ted Bertuccio from Giffard's shower stabbing case was that assistant prosecutor. He told us he didn't really care what they printed about him and his boss, but he does still have these newspapers in his office, and he's underlined sentences and written "not true" next to them in red pen. So I think it's fair to say it was a sore spot.
He just wanted to solve the case. That's all we were trying to do. There was no second agenda.
Ted said it all stemmed from debate about the direction of the case.
It led to headbutting and arguments and other than rational debate, and eventually led to the now retired chief of police of Princeton trying to exonerate himself by saying the only reason the case isn't solved is because the county prosecutor and his assistant prosecutor interfered with the investigation, which is so far from true, it's laughable.
But in a letter that ex-chief Michael Carnevale shared with the newspaper, Pete Koenig seemed furious about what they were pursuing. The prosecutor urged them to reconsider Gerald Giffard, calling him a, quote, prime suspect for Sissy's murder.
In the press, Pete Koenig denied showing the Stewarts any favoritism, said they were just acquaintances. The article said the prosecutor had known Charles and Jeb Stewart, quote, for many years. And wherever we went, we heard different variations of how Pete Koenig knew the family.
But when I called him up to ask about it, he hung up real fast.
Ted Bertuccio said there was nothing nefarious going on, but he did acknowledge the prosecutor knew the family, and he gave the police his opinion.
Just like we would say with anybody we know that long, there's no freaking way that they would do this. That was communicated, but they were not eliminated as suspects. It was more along the lines of, let's not waste time and energy.
I mean, that may not be in order, but if you're under the prosecutor's authority, it still seems like a pretty clear message to not pursue them.
But we don't just have these claims from old newspaper clippings.
That's right. We also have Ralph Teresiano.
So at one point, I was in Pete Koenig's office, and I was telling him that we need to look into Jeb Stewart a little more. There were some of his actions or inactions which I couldn't explain. And he told me point blank to leave him alone and that he didn't do it.
What was your reaction? What did you think about that?
I felt that it was out of line. I thought it was unethical. Who was he to tell me, and what was the depth of his investigative experience to tell me that this guy had nothing to do with it?
Wow, that sounds pretty direct. And you can hear Ralph is still pretty fired up about this.
But the prosecutor can direct investigations. It's really the motive, any conflict of interest, that's at the heart of this. We needed to understand the nature of the relationship between Pete Koenig and the family. So we did some digging. News archives, alumni magazines, even old fraternity documents.
We learned that the rumors they grew up together weren't true. They lived in towns 10 miles apart.
But one thing we did hear.
Charles Stewart, Jeb's brother, had went to Dartmouth with Pete Koenig.
That was true. Pete Koenig and Charles Stewart overlapped at the Ivy League college for 2 years in the mid-60s. But I couldn't find any evidence that they participated in the same activities. I requested old journals of pledge names from Charles's fraternity. They showed Pete Koenig wasn't in the same frat.
As to whether Jeb and Pete Koenig knew each other as adults, it certainly isn't hard to imagine that they would. They're both running in the respected, privileged circles of the county.
But officially, all we could find was what Pete Koenig told the Trentonian, that he played paddle tennis with Jeb and Sheila.
Then we tried one last thing, sending Pete Koenig a letter, explaining why we wanted to get to the bottom of this. And it worked. Here's Rebecca telling me about it last summer.
I saw the Florida number and I was like, oh, I really hope that's Pete Koenig. He didn't want to be recorded, but he was fine to be on the record. So that was, good enough for me. And it all started with this paddle tennis thing.
Is it like a precursor to pickleball or something?
I sort of think it might be.
We're not going to give you a lesson in obscure sports here. There was a group of couples that played this sport in Princeton, and it included Pete Koenig as well as Jeb and Sheila. But Pete said they weren't partners or anything, never on the same side of the net. He said he was acquainted with Jeb and Sheila, but they were not friends and didn't really socialize.
But he said, and this is sort of like as social as it got, he said, I may have been at a third party's home with 20 or 25 people when they were present. I do seem to recall that would happen.
That's pretty interesting.
And as for him being at Dartmouth with Charles Stewart, Pete said he knew Charles's name because he was a good hockey player. But he, quote, never spoke to Charles Stewart ever until after his mother was dead. So finally, I told him what Ralph remembered of their conversation, to stop looking at Jeb.
And Koenig said, I never said stop looking. I may have said, I don't think it's going to be fruitful. I don't ever remember him briefing me. I'm not saying he didn't, but I don't believe I ever said stop looking into the Stewarts.
Yeah, that still sounds like we think you're barking up the wrong tree, like how Ted Bertuccio portrayed it.
Right, but that wasn't it. Here's the rest of what Pete said.
But they had no evidence with respect to Jeb Stewart or Charles Stewart that they brought to my attention that would have even made a scintilla on the probable cause. And that's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's pretty strong.
Yeah, no, I
This point about not having probable cause is a pretty important one. I don't doubt that a message was delivered to Princeton police, but what was the effect? It wasn't like police were ready to make an arrest and the prosecutor was the only thing standing in their way.
Nope. In reality, police weren't even close to pursuing charges.
But they also weren't anywhere close to quitting, no matter what anyone told them.
After the break, how they were able to cross someone else off their list. In 1992, a year after the revelations in the Trentonian, Ralph Teresiano's pursuit of the Stewart case got a major boost. There was a new county prosecutor, and she greenlit the creation of a task force to dive into the case again, with 3 of her own detectives assisting.
This wasn't a cold case. They were working it hard. And because they were going over every detail with fresh eyes, they looked again at Gerald Giffard.
Giffard was a scary guy to talk to. Again, very slight and built, but his eyes were penetrating, and like they went right through you.
Ralph went to the state prison where Gerald Giffard was doing 20 years for stabbing the grad student in her shower. And Ralph asked him about the documentary, My Mother's Murder. Gerald had seen it.
I says, well, do you know that they point you as a suspect? He said, yes, I do. And I said, well, I'd like you to clear your name and I'd like you to take a polygraph. And he did, but he did say, give his parameters. I'll take a polygraph, but you could only ask me about that case, nothing else. And he passed 2 polygraphs, and he passed them.
I actually tracked down one of the polygraph operators who gave this lie detector test to Gerald. He agreed it was a good sign that Gerald said they could ask him about Sissy, but nothing else.
Right, regardless of the accuracy of the test, that seems like something you would do if you knew you had skeletons in your closet, but Sissy Stewart wasn't one of them. Ralph said he was satisfied.
We managed to get a prosecutor's office memo about this task force. It shows they did 85 interviews, including dozens of Sissy's neighbors, and they reviewed evidence and even polygraphed a few local men who didn't have alibis.
The memo confirms what Ralph told us, that all the new work just brought the task force around to the same old questions about Jeb Stewart. But what more could they do? His attorney told Ralph they couldn't re-interview Jeb or polygraph him.
They actually consulted with the FBI on strategy and came up with an indirect but aggressive approach, a kind of blitz on everyone around Jeb.
They talked to his close friends, his neighbors, current or former employees of the newspaper, even Jeb's realtor and a lawn guy who worked in the neighborhood.
They wanted useful information, but they also thought that by asking certain questions, those questions would get back to Jeb.
Maybe we can get somebody who would say something that could to lead to an arrest or at least an explanation of what Jeb did or didn't do. But yeah, we thought that maybe it would make him do or say something that would help us out. Maybe even clear his name.
But it didn't happen. One thing that did happen, Ralph said, was that Jeb's attorney accused him of harassing his client. And you can see why.
Right, he's innocent until proven guilty. But the police are questioning everyone he knows about him and a murder investigation. And you know word gets around a place like Princeton.
And after all that, it's a very real possibility that the reason detectives couldn't find anything solid on Jeb is because there wasn't anything to find.
Maybe whoever did this was just completely not on the police department's radar. And that idea is something Catherine Ramsland, the forensic psychologist, brought up to us about how police, in general, handle investigations.
They make all their deductions based on the known facts when there could still be things they don't know that might have a significant impact on the way they see this. So when you say reportedly she had no enemies, that doesn't mean she had no enemies. It means only we didn't find any.
So here's an example of this, how you can't know what you don't know. There was a neighbor of Sissy's, a young woman, who authorities said had mental health issues. Police did look into her, but documents show she was cleared, first in 1989, and a few years later when they checked her out again.
We looked into this particular girl because she was known to go off her medication once in a while. She had confrontations with people. There was word that she had cut through Mrs. Stewart's property as a shortcut, and that there was some talk between the two of them, and it wasn't friendly. But she had no history of anything violent per se, no using a weapon. She had an alibi. She was in town shopping. We talked to her friend she was with.
We talked about this with Angelo Onofre, the current Mercer County prosecutor. He said this woman visited her friend working at the Ann Taylor store in town. They both went back to spend the friend's break at the woman's home near Sissy's. Then the friend went back to work.
But newspaper ads we found show the store closed at 5 on Sundays back in 1989. So during the window for Sissy's time of death, this young woman was actually home with her parents. Ralph said her parents reported there was nothing unusual about her that day.
So why are we talking about all this? It's because Ralph said she wasn't violent and had no history of using weapons. And that may have been true right after the crime, but it isn't anymore.
I'm afraid for the safety of my family. She's proven herself to be physically violent.
This is a victim speaking in a court hearing in 2011, after the woman was charged for pounding on a family's door at night and smashing a window with a brick, in the midst of what she later explained were paranoid delusions. Here's the victim again.
We were really, really scared that night. I thought it was a home invasion going on.
Records show she has been involved in violent incidents over the years. Police documents refer to a series of physical confrontations downtown in 1994. In more recent years, the records show several allegations of assault, but charges were always dismissed or downgraded.
But in 2019, there was a much more serious incident. On a busy downtown street, she was wielding a kitchen knife and refused to drop it, even at gunpoint, surrounded by police. Court documents show it ended when they eventually tackled her.
Now, remember, police and prosecutors have said they are satisfied with her alibi. And by all accounts, this woman wasn't in any kind of mental health crisis on the day of Sissy's murder. But this is to show you, again, how it always seems with this case. Just when you think you can completely cross someone off the list, things can happen or new information is found. And suddenly, a question as basic as whether someone is or isn't violent becomes a lot more complicated. In 1999, the prosecutor's office partnered with the FBI to craft a press release about the 10-year anniversary to try to elicit new info.
That was shortly after Angelo Onofre was first hired to the office as an assistant prosecutor.
I recall in 1999, us working with the FBI on a 10-year anniversary story with the Behavioral Analysis Unit, and I was part of the team that drafted that press release.
Can you say at all what the FBI behavioral analysis people thought of the case?
The National Center for Violent Crime and McLaughlin, which is one of the police support agencies that's used, they felt that the victim was known to the attacker, and they also combed the Northeast, all the databases that they had available to them, and they didn't find any similar MO throughout the Northeast.
But they didn't get any big tips from this press release. And advancing DNA technology also didn't crack the case. They submitted Sissy's sweater to a lab, but got nothing useful in return.
And within a few more years, in 2002, the case was losing its lead detective. Ralph Teresiano was retiring early due to hearing loss from the bank robbery shooting. It wasn't clear who would take over the case next, or if the case file would just collect dust without its champion.
And then, a chance encounter.
The last week of my retirement, I was on Palmer Square, and there was a sub shop there. I was walking in, and Jeb Stewart was walking out, and he had no love for me whatsoever. So said hello to him. He walked past me, and I know he went there regularly. So the lady that owned it was working, and I said, "So what's new with Jeb Stewart?" And she said, "Well, his wife wants a divorce, and he's got a girlfriend."
To Ralph, this looks like an opportunity. A chance that cracks might be appearing in the Stewart family fortress of silence.
It is just gossip. We know Jeb and Sheila never got divorced. But still, on the eve of his retirement, Ralph passes it on to the prosecutor's office and someone you'll remember from Princeton police.
Then Captain Tony Federico. And Tony was intrigued. And he wanted to talk to this supposed girlfriend.
Tony called me shortly thereafter, pretty excited, said that she came in, he talked to her.
Do you suspect that that information that Tony learned from this person, that is what set off his renewed interest in the case in 2002, 2003?
Oh, definitely. Tony kind of had a stake in it because he took the initial missing person report. I don't know what his degree of investigative skills were. I know he was never a detective, but Tony, what he might have lacked in investigative skills, he more than made up in drive, that he wanted to see this thing solved.
He wasn't a detective, but he had chutzpah and ambition. And he wasn't about to hand the case to the detective bureau. He plunked the boxes of case files down on his own desk.
This was the beginning of Tony's obsession with the case. I spent some time in that office. On the wall behind him, he had one of the original flyers for the reward for information in Sissy's murder.
So what was it that Tony Federico heard from this woman about Jeb? What sent him tearing off after this case for the rest of his career, the rest of his life?
It became clear that it's possible he didn't kill his mother. Maybe he was covering for somebody.
Ralph and the other investigators had always believed this relative's alibi witnesses were interviewed thoroughly. But they'd soon learn that wasn't true.
A certain son of Princeton,
who said he was at a Grateful Dead show.
Coming up, we'll go along as this murder investigation finds its way to Europe, Canada, and some very prominent offices in New York City.
Because where else would you expect the graduates of Princeton's class of 1992 to end up, but at the top of the world?
Next time on In the Shadow of Princeton.
She becomes a confidential informant.
My sergeant at the time would not have allowed a phone interview to confirm an alibi.
So I can confirm that I was there at a show in Pittsburgh.
They were alibying him on Monday, so they couldn't find her till Tuesday.
In the Shadow of Princeton is a production of NJ Advanced Media. Reporting is by me and Rebecca Everett. Rebecca wrote and produced the podcast. Christopher Kelly and Jeff Roberts are executive producers.
Our sound engineer for this episode is Rishi Bajekal. Our composer is Blake Maples. James Shapiro is our associate audio engineer.
Our voice actor is Natalie Patterson. Our website was designed by Alaa Salim.
Special thanks to all our sources who agreed to talk to us. You can visit theprincetonmurder.com for more about the story, including photos and other extras. And you can email us at inbox@theprincetonmurder.com.
Follow In the Shadow of Princeton. And if you're enjoying it, please rate and review it and help us spread the word.